The shot wasn't supposed to happen. That was the first thing Colonel Whitfield said when he walked into the briefing room at CFB Trenton 40 minutes after the incident, still holding his coffee like he'd forgotten it was there. He set it on the table. He looked at the board. He looked at the name written on the board. And he said nothing else for a long time. The woman whose name was on the board was sitting in a chair in the hallway outside, still in her range vest, still with chalk dust on her fingers from the wind calculation she'd done on the back of a clipboard before she'd taken the shot that wasn't supposed to happen. Her name was Fenn. Specialist Audrey Fenn, 29 years old. Seconded from a logistics unit in Petawawa 8 weeks earlier because someone in the coordination office had made an error in the paperwork and she had not corrected them. That detail matters. It matters because Fenn had understood, from the moment she arrived at the range facility in Trenton, that she was not supposed to be there. Not in the way the others were. The snipers who trained alongside her, Caulfield, Stroud, a taciturn Quebecois named Desjardins who spoke to no one before noon, had been selected through a process that took 18 months and left most candidates at the starting point. Fenn had arrived because of a clerical error. She'd been given a bunk and a schedule and a range assignment, and no one had asked too many questions, because in the particular bureaucratic machinery of a joint training exercise, asking questions created paperwork, and paperwork slowed everything down. So she stayed, and she shot, and for 7 weeks, no one paid particular attention to what she was doing. This is a thing that happens more than people realize, and it happens because of something specific about the way human attention distributes itself in a group. It clusters. In any cohort, observers, instructors, coordinators, evaluators focus on the people who are performing loudest, not best, loudest. Caulfield had a competition background and shot with a fluency that was almost theatrical. He knew when people were watching and he adjusted his posture accordingly. Stroud asked questions constantly, good questions, the kind that demonstrated he'd been thinking about the material all night. They pulled attention the way certain colors pull the eye. Fenn shot quietly. She arrived at her lane. She set up without talking. She ran her calculations in the small notebook she kept in her left breast pocket, and when she was satisfied, she shot. Then she recorded her data and moved on. The groupings she produced. At 800 meters, at 1100, at the 1400-meter lane that most of the cohort hadn't been cleared to use yet, were the kind of groupings that if someone had been watching would have immediately ended the question of how she'd ended up there. But no one was watching, not in the way that counted. The instructor assigned to her lane was a sergeant named Breckenridge. He was 2 years from retirement and not unhappy about it, and he had developed over his career a finely calibrated sense of which trainees needed intervention and which ones could be left to their own trajectory. Fenn struck him as the latter. She never asked him to come look at her target. She never flagged a concern. She just worked quietly at the far end of the lane, and Breckenridge let her, and neither of them discussed it. The morning of the incident, which is what it was called in the official record, incident, a word that implies accident but does not commit to it. Fenn had been on the range since 0530. The exercise was a joint coordination drill involving 3 range teams and a command element that was supposed to simulate the kind of real-time targeting environment that had become common in northern operations. The scenario required a designated marksman to hold position at an observation point 1,340 meters from a target zone while a ground team worked through the intermediate space. It was, in theory, a straightforward exercise. In practice, it was the kind of drill that collapsed under the weight of its own moving parts. The collapse began at 0742. A data relay between the command post and the range teams failed. A technical fault that the after-action report would later identify as a loose connection in a junction box that had been flagged for maintenance 6 weeks earlier and not repaired. The failure meant that the ground team, unaware of their position data, was no longer reaching the command element, continued advancing into the target zone at the same moment the command element, believing them still in the safe corridor, cleared the designated marksman to engage. The designated marksman was Caulfield. Caulfield received the clearance. Caulfield acquired his target. And Caulfield, who was an excellent shot, and had a competition background and knew how to perform when people were watching, began his trigger sequence. What happened next took approximately 4 seconds and has been reconstructed since from multiple sources. The range recording system, 2 personal accounts, and the wind log that Fenn had been keeping in her notebook since 0600, which turned out to be the most precise record of conditions on the range that morning. Fenn saw it before anyone in the command post did. She was positioned at an elevated observation point 40 meters to the left of Caulfield's lane. Not a firing position, technically, but an observation post that had been assigned to her as part of the coordination exercise. She had her spotting scope, she had her wind log, and she had, in the 7 weeks she had been at that range, developed a precise understanding of the way the ground team moved, because she had been watching them every morning when no one was watching her. She recognized the body language of the team lead, a corporal named Witchwood, compact and fast-moving and always slightly ahead of his right-side partner, at 1,340 meters, in deteriorating light, through a spotting scope in approximately half a second. She keyed her radio. Hold. Ground team is inside the arc. Witchwood is 30 meters short of the safe boundary. Do not engage, I say again, do not engage. There was a silence on the channel, then a voice she didn't know. Who is this? Fenn. Observation post 4. Ground team is inside the arc. Do you copy? Another silence, longer this time. The kind of silence that in a coordination exercise can mean the radio hasn't switched channels, or means someone is checking a roster to see whether observation post 4 exists, or means someone is deciding whether a voice they don't recognize has the authority to halt a drill. Caulfield held his shot. He said later that he had heard something in the voice on the radio. He couldn't explain what. He was a precise man who preferred precise language, and he did not like saying he had acted on instinct, but when pressed, in the debrief that went for 3 hours the following morning, that was the word he used. He held. The ground team was recalled. Witchwood, contacted directly by the command element on a separate channel, confirmed position. He was 32 meters inside the boundary. He had not known. The relay failure had taken his GPS data with it. Colonel Whitfield arrived 40 minutes later. He walked into the briefing room and he looked at the board and he looked at the name written on the board, and then he walked back out into the hallway and looked at the woman sitting in the chair with chalk on her fingers. "You're Fenn," he said. "Yes, sir." "From Petawawa." "Yes, sir." He looked at her for a moment. Not the way commanding officers sometimes look at junior personnel when they're deciding how much trouble something is going to create. He looked at her the way someone looks at a thing that doesn't fit into the category they've prepared for it. "You calculated the arc deviation manually," he said. "It wasn't quite a question. The relay was down. There was nothing else to use. You did it in your head." "In my notebook," she said. "I've been logging conditions since 0600. The deviation was within a calculable range given wind data and the team's observed pace." Whitfield was quiet for a moment. Behind him, through the open door of the briefing room, Fenn could see 2 captains and an exercise coordinator looking at each other. "What's your background?" Whitfield said. This was the question Fenn had been waiting for. Not dreading, exactly, but waiting for, in the way that you wait for a thing you know is coming and have not decided how to handle. She told him she was from a logistics unit, that she'd been assigned to the exercise by transfer order, that she had, before joining the Canadian Armed Forces, completed a degree in applied mathematics at Dalhousie, with a concentration in stochastic modeling, that before that, she had grown up in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, where her father had taught her to shoot groundhogs at distance when she was 11 years old, and the groundhogs had been eating the garden, and that she had found, over the years, that the 2 things, the mathematics and the groundhogs, turned out to be related. One of the captains in the doorway made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. Whitfield looked at her for another long moment. "You've been here 8 weeks, he said. "Yes, sir. And no one ran your range numbers." Fenn said nothing. This was not a question that had an answer she was willing to give in a hallway. Whitfield understood the silence. He'd spent 23 years learning how silences work. "Come inside," he said. What followed in that briefing room was not a reprimand. It was something closer to a reckoning, though not of the kind Fenn had anticipated. Whitfield had pulled her range data within 20 minutes of arriving at the facility, a phone call to Breckenridge, who sounded, on the other end of the line, like a man suddenly reviewing a situation he had understood incorrectly. The data came through on a tablet. Whitfield looked at it for a while without speaking. Then he passed it to Captain Lariviere, who was responsible for the coordination exercise and had spent the last 40 minutes writing an incident report in which Fenn's role was described as auxiliary observation support. Lariviere looked at the data. He looked at it for quite a long time. The numbers told a specific story. Over 7 weeks of range work, across 34 documented sessions, Fenn had produced groupings that placed her in the top 4% of all designated marksman assessments conducted at CFB Trenton in the preceding 5 years. At 400 meters, the lane that most of the cohort hadn't been cleared for, she had produced 3 consecutive sessions of sub-MOA accuracy under variable wind conditions, using a rifle she had been issued as secondary equipment and had not asked to swap out. She had never flagged any of this. She had never asked for evaluation. She had done the work and recorded the data and left it in a logbook that Breckenridge had been collecting weekly and had not opened. The room had a particular quality of silence in it when Lariviere set the tablet down. It was the silence of people recalibrating. Fenn sat in the chair they had given her, and she looked at the wall and she did not say anything. Because she had learned over the years that when rooms recalibrate, talking does not help. Whitfield said, "You understand what this means?" "I think so, sir. It means that for 8 weeks you have been operating at a level that this facility is specifically designed to identify and develop, and you have been invisible." Fenn looked at him. "I'm aware of that, sir. Why didn't you say something?" She considered the question carefully. Not because she didn't know the answer. She knew the answer exactly. She considered it because she was deciding how much of the answer was hers to give. "I was assigned here on a transfer order that contained a clerical error," she said, finally. "I was aware that my presence in this training stream was irregular. I made a judgment call that drawing attention to myself would result in my reassignment before the training was complete." Whitfield looked at her. "So you let us not notice you?" "I let the work speak for itself," she said. "I was waiting for someone to read the logbook." Breckenridge, who had arrived in the briefing room about 10 minutes earlier and had taken a seat near the door and had said nothing since, made a small sound at this. No one looked at him. Lariviere said, "The transfer order, the clerical error. What was the original assignment?" "Supply inventory audits, CFB Borden," Fenn said. "I was supposed to be counting materiel. Someone transposed the base codes, and you didn't correct it." "No, sir." Another silence. Lariviere had the look of someone doing arithmetic in his head that wasn't coming out to a number he liked. "Why not?" he said. Fenn had been thinking about how to answer this question since approximately her second day at the range, when she had realized the error was not going to surface on its own and that she could either report it or wait. She had waited, not because she was dishonest. There was nothing dishonest about what she had done, technically speaking. She had followed every order she had been given. She had met every obligation of the training schedule. She had not misrepresented herself to anyone who had directly asked. But she had not corrected a mistake that would have sent her back to counting inventory in Borden, and she had not corrected it because she had known from the first morning on the range what the numbers were going to say, and she had wanted someone else to read them first. "Because I wanted to know if the work was what I thought it was," she said, "and because if I'd reported the error and been reassigned before anyone had read the data, the question would have remained open." Whitfield looked at her for a long time. "And is it," he said, "what you thought it was?" "That's not my assessment to make, sir." He almost smiled at that. Not quite. The debrief ran for most of the morning. Whitfield came in at one point, still in his field kit, dirt on his knees from the ground position, and sat down and answered questions and then looked at Fenn and said, with a directness that had nothing performed about it, "You had my voice recognition at 1,300 meters in low light through a spot scope?" "Your movement pattern," Fenn said. "You favor your left when you're ahead of pace. You were moving fast this morning." Whitfield looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once and said nothing else. which was in its way a more complete acknowledgement than anything that had been said in the room all morning. The exercise coordinator, a civilian contractor named Ashby, who had been in and out of the room all morning, with a laptop and a look of concentrated professional distress, eventually produced a revised incident report that described the morning's events in language so careful it read almost like poetry. Fenn's role was described as critical intervention by auxiliary personnel whose full profile had not been integrated into the exercise command structure. Lariviere signed it. He did not look happy about the phrasing, but he signed it. Whitfield did not sign it. He read it, set it down, and said he would be submitting a separate assessment. He did not say what the assessment would contain, and no one asked, because the way he said it made it clear that the answer was not available in that room at that time. The days that followed had a different texture than the 7 weeks before them. Fenn noticed it the way you notice a pressure change, not in any single moment, but in the accumulation of small things. Stroud, who had spoken to her precisely 4 times in 2 months, began stopping at her lane to watch her set up, not to critique, not to offer advice. He just stood there with his arms crossed and watched and then moved on. Desjardins, who spoke to no one before noon, spoke to her at Zo 740 on a Tuesday, which she understood to be, by his standards, a significant gesture. He asked her what notebook she used. She told him. He wrote it down. Breckenridge came to find her on the range the morning after the debrief. He stood a few meters back from her position and waited until she'd finished her sequence and cleared the weapon. Then he said, "I should have read the logbook." Fenn considered several responses. She chose the simplest one. "Yes," she said, "but the data is still the data." He stood there for another moment. "That's a generous way to put it. It's an accurate way to put it," she said. He nodded. He left. She went back to her sequence. The paperwork, when it arrived quietly, which was not the way Fenn had expected it, if she'd expected it at all. A reassignment order, a new designation, a range clearance that took her above the classifications she'd been informally working within for weeks. Not a promotion exactly, something more like a correction. An acknowledgement that the category she had been placed in was the wrong category, and that the system, having been made aware of its error, was adjusting. There was a moment, a few days after the new orders came through, when Lariviere stopped her in the corridor between the command post and the range block. He had the look of a man who had thought about something for a while and decided to say it anyway. "The relay failure," he said. "You knew about it before the drill started." Fenn looked at him. "I observed the junction box flag in the maintenance log." "Yes, Bussy? And you didn't report it?" "I reported it 6 weeks ago," she said. "The report is in the maintenance system under my personnel number. It's dated the same day I arrived." Lariviere was very still for a moment. "You filed a maintenance report on a relay junction box in the first week you were here." "Yes, sir. It was in my observation area. It was flagged in the log as overdue for service. I submitted a follow-up request through the standard channel." She paused. "I also submitted one at week 3 and week 6. The stillness continued. "None of those were actioned," he said. "No, sir." There was a long pause. Outside, somewhere on the range, a drill sequence started. The distant, rhythmic sound of a coordination exercise working through its opening phase. "So you knew," Lariviere said slowly, "that there was a live failure point in the relay system. And on the morning of the drill, you were at observation post 4. "Yes, sir," which is not a standard observation post for a coordination exercise. "No, sir, I requested the assignment the day before." "Through Breckenridge." Lariviere looked at her for a long moment. He was a careful man, methodical, the kind of officer who did not like reaching conclusions he hadn't constructed step by step. But the steps here were not complicated, and they were leading somewhere very specific. "You positioned yourself," he said, "at the point in the exercise where a relay failure would create the highest probability of a targeting error, on a morning when you had reason to believe the relay was not functioning reliably, and you brought a spotting scope and a wind log and 8 weeks of observed ground team movement data." Fenn said nothing. "That's not auxiliary observation support," Lariviere said. "No, sir," Fenn said. "I don't believe it is." He looked at her for a long time, then he said, "The request for observation post 4. You put it in through Breckenridge." "Yes, sir." Because if you'd put it in through the command channel, it would have raised questions about why you wanted that specific position. I thought the position was appropriate for the conditions, Fenn said. I requested it for the reasons I would have given if anyone had asked. Lariviere was quiet again. Around them, the corridor was empty. Everyone was on the range or in the command post, and they were alone in the particular way that institutional spaces become empty in the middle of a working day. Why didn't you flag the relay failure the morning of the exercise, he said, if you knew it was compromised? This was the question Fenn had been expecting, not from Lariviere specifically, from someone. She had been carrying the answer to it for a while. Because I'd flagged it 3 times through the maintenance channel, she said, and 3 times nothing happened. And, on the morning of the exercise, flagging it through the command channel would have delayed the drill, and the decision to delay would have gone to the exercise coordinator, who would have had to weigh my assessment from a logistics specialist assigned here on an irregular transfer against the schedule and the resource commitments and the attending personnel. And I calculated that the probability of the delay being approved was low. She stopped. So I chose the position where I could act if the failure occurred, she said, rather than trying to prevent an outcome I couldn't guarantee would be taken seriously. Lariviere was quiet for a long time. You trusted your own calculation more than the system, he said. I trusted the data, she said. The system had already told me 3 times what it was going to do with the data. He didn't answer that. There was nothing to answer. He had signed 3 maintenance request logs in his time at this facility, and he did not know if any of them had been actioned, and he was old enough and honest enough to know what that said. Whitfield's separate assessment came through 11 days after the incident. Fenn was not party to its contents until much later. What she knew at the time was that the new orders continued to arrive, each one adjusting something further. Range access, classification level, a slot in a specialized training stream that had a waiting list of people who had applied through the normal process. She moved through the adjustments with the same methodical quiet she'd brought to the range. She did not discuss them with Caulfield or Stroud or Desjardins. She showed up to each new context, and she did the work, and she let the data accumulate. The thing about living at the margins of a system's attention is that it teaches you something the center of the system never learns. How to read what's coming from a long way off. You develop a patience that isn't passive. It's a very active waiting, a constant triangulation between what you observe and what you expect, and what you know the gap between those two things usually means. You learn that most errors aren't failures of capability, they're failures of attention, and attention, unlike capability, can be shaped. Fenn had been shaping attention for 8 weeks, not deceptively, not maliciously. She had worked quietly at the far end of the lane and recorded her data and waited for someone to read the logbook. And when the moment came, when a life depended not on the logbook, but on the woman who had been filling it in every morning since June, she had been there. She had been there because she had understood that being there was the work, and the work was always the point. Months later, in a different facility in a different province, a training coordinator named Alderson, who had heard about the Trenton incident from a colleague who had heard it from Lariviere, would ask Fenn, in the plain-spoken way that people in his position ask things, how she had known. He meant, how had she known to be at that observation point? How had she known Caulfield was going to fire? How had she known Witchwood was inside the Ark? Fenn thought about the question for a moment. I'd been watching Witchwood move for 8 weeks, she said. I knew how fast he pushed his pace when he was behind. I knew how far ahead of his right-side partner he'd drift when the ground was firm. I knew what his silhouette looked like at 1,300 meters when he was moving towards something and when he was moving away from it. She paused. I didn't know anything. I'd just been paying attention for a long time. Alderson nodded slowly. He wrote something in the notebook he always carried. And the relay junction box, he said, the 3 maintenance requests. The data was there, she said. The system just wasn't reading it. He looked at her. Is that why you stayed? When you knew about the transfer error? Because the system wasn't reading the data. She considered that for a moment. It was the most honest version of the question anyone had asked her. I stayed because the data wasn't finished yet, she said, and because I wanted to know what it would say when someone finally did. She looked out the window of his office, where the range was visible in the middle distance, a flat gray strip against the October tree line. Somewhere out there, a cohort was running drills. Somewhere out there, a logbook was filling up with numbers that someone would read eventually or wouldn't. I think, she said, the work is always what it is, regardless of whether anyone is watching. Alderson wrote that down too.